Sorry about that. Y'all are there?
Yes, I'm here. I hope Cory's there.
I'm here.
All right. I would like to welcome everybody and thank them for joining. I'm Jana Langhorn. I'm the Senior Director of Marketing here at CynergisTek, and I will be moderating today's webinar. In just a minute, you'll hear from our diverse group of connected device and medical device experts. But before we get started, I would like to go over a couple of housekeeping rules with you. All the attendees will be on mute during the presentation, but at any time, feel free to ask questions by using the chat feature in the control panel of GoToWebinar. Please be sure to only send it to the organizers and panelists by selecting that choice in the drop-down box, as you can see over here in the right-hand corner. And then about 10 to 15 minutes before the hour, we'll stop to address questions that were sent through the chat box. And then also, we will send a copy of the presentation to all the attendees later today. And with that said, I would like to go on ahead and welcome our three speakers. First, you'll hear from David Fenn. He's the Executive Vice President of Strategic Innovation at CynergisTek. David has been in the healthcare IT field for over 30 years. He has spent most of that time in the provider space in a variety of roles, ranging from a system auditor to a CIO at a large children's hospital, as well as a security and privacy officer. He's participated on the boards of Chime and HIMSS North America, as well as a local federally qualified health center and a population health organization based in his hometown of Houston. Additionally, he was a member of the HHS task force and worked with the 405D working group. This year, he served on Chime's Most Wired governing boards and the AHIS advisory boards, as well as many other editorial boards. Then next, you'll hear from Cory Blacketer. She's an information security consultant focused on medical device security here at CynergisTek. Prior to CynergisTek, she was involved in developing and managing medical device programs and has been a key participant in helping bridge the gap between information security and clinical engineering in the hospital setting. And then you will hear from Shankar. He's the CEO and co-founder of Asimily, which is a connected device lifecycle management solution focused on healthcare. He's specifically been involved in medical device risk since 2012 and has contributed to many standards, frameworks, and books on the topic. Prior to his time in the medical device arena, he held several leadership roles at various technology companies. And then with that said, I will turn it over to you, David, then to get our presentation started.
Thanks, Jana. I appreciate it. I have the rare privilege of being the first presenter on today's webinar. So I want to thank you all for attending and taking the time. I also have the dubious distinction of being the oldest presenter today, but fortunately for all of you on the call who are listening, I am not the smartest. We have the two smart people, Cory and Shankar, coming up. We're going to share some of their insights around addressing this incredibly complex and critical issue. My job today is to kind of set the stage for where we are and how we got there. And so I can't completely skip the history, but I'll tell you that when I started in healthcare about 30 years ago, it was as an IT systems auditor. And frankly, until about Y2K, we didn't hear much about the biomedical engineering people, or what we called the clinical technology or medical technology at that point. In Y2K, when we were addressing a lot of those concerns, it came to everyone's attention that these devices may have dates and all that kind of stuff that needed to be addressed, but they weren't really thought of as information technology systems. Clinical engineering back then was really maintenance focused. It was management and consulting services and support for very discrete equipment. The equipment didn't get on the network. It didn't even talk to each other. So a big sea change in that area. But today, clinical engineering is really about technology management, starting with the strategy and then addressing issues of quality of care, patient safety, and the entire life cycle of these medical devices. It is no longer just take care of it and replace it. It isn't uncommon to see clinical engineers who are involved in training around these medical devices, both on the hardware and the software, and supporting those tools. There are regulatory and compliance issues. If your biomedical device vendor is outsourced, there's going to be vendor management. And even if there isn't an outsourced partner, there's going to be vendor management around the products and tools you're buying. There's asset management, just like we have with desktops and laptops and servers. And you've got installation and integration of these tools, which is frankly new as we've brought them onto the network and integrated them with other systems. IT, when I started, was really focused on the business side of healthcare. We didn't have clinical systems. It was focused on accounting and billing and accounts payable and payroll and supply chain. There was no such thing when I started as an EMR or other specialty clinical systems, ancillary departments with their own systems. That has all come up as we've moved into the late 20th and early 21st century. But today, because of the rapid growth since 2009 and the rapid integration of the EMR, today, whether you're in information technology or the medical technology side of the world, it is all about patient care. And that starts with clinical workflows, clinical decision support. It's all about quality of care and outcomes measurement. And that leads to shifts in risk. We have shifted the risk from technical security, which you still have to address, but you can't focus solely on clinical ops and the specific device anymore. You may be placing everything else on your network at risk. Next slide. I'm sure I don't need to tell anyone on this call that healthcare has some unique security challenges. And I'm not going to go through every box here, but some of the high points are in the IT world, we frequently keep computers for maybe 4 or 5 years. Maybe servers are a little longer. But in healthcare, we keep these medical devices for 14, 15, even longer. And that creates, in this integrated network world, a lot of different issues. There's an extremely large variety of devices, vendors, and device types in the biomedical world. There are literally thousands of device makers, and they range from some of the largest companies in the world to little mom and pop shops who have a small number of devices, but they're very niche, very technical, and specific and specialty devices. And one of the things we've found is that even the same device from the same manufacturer, configured in the same way, presents different risks on different networks. The same device on the same network can be different depending on how it's configured and what other devices it's talking to. You've got technology and regulatory constraints which are unique to healthcare. You have unique protocols and data sources. You may be dealing with everything from a blood pressure cuff to a neurological study with brain probes feeding data. And some of that is done over unique protocols, whether it's DICOM or HL7. In the clinical world, you have metadata that's widely distributed, and that isn't just the technical metadata about the device and the software and hardware. That is clinical metadata as well in many cases, and that may require special protections. Genomic devices may have data that other devices don't have, and so we have to be aware of and looking at all of that. And then we have non-medical medical devices. A desktop computer in radiology may be the receptionist workstation until the head of radiology walks up and decides he's going to view clinical studies on that device. And all of a sudden, because it's talking to different systems, it becomes a medical device. And providers have to deal with some very unique issues, limited visibility. We're just getting used to connecting medical devices to the network, so we may not have networks configured. We may have devices on VLANs. We may not be seeing everything in the right way. We have more medical devices typically in a hospital setting or a care setting than we have PCs and servers and laptops and other devices. So patching them is not a trivial issue if they need to be patched. Sometimes that may not be the case. And then we have some very unique risk factors in healthcare, not the least of which is the cultural issue between the legacy clinical engineering and the traditional IT approach to issues. So all of those things together on top of the other unique challenges can lead to operational inefficiency and more security risks. And it's important, as you have all this complexity, it becomes even more important to prioritize issues. We're used to doing that on the security side of the world, but because of the additional risks, the prioritization becomes even more critical with these medical devices or health technology. So what's the path forward? Next slide. This is what I've been seeing, and that is the convergence of medical technology and information technology, then and now approach. And again, I'm not going to go through every bulletin box here, but we have a great convergence. And so because the medical technology has some unique risks around patient safety, around clinical ops, it's important that we not just cut them out from that silo and treat them differently, but that we incorporate them and look at our integrated technologies. We all have specific risks around IT, around telecommunications, around medical technology, but medical technology is addressing the patient care and the quality of care and patient safety issues. So they have to be at that table, and we have to take that view of these issues, not the traditional IT and telecommunications view of that. Next slide. And even today, we still see this kind of dual-edged approach. And if you take only the endpoint on the network, we kind of have a good idea of what that looks like. It's a traditional security approach. You scan, you identify the security vulnerabilities, you look at fixes and prioritize them, you patch and mitigate, you rinse and repeat. In the medical device world, it is more than a security approach. We're really talking about patient care and safety. I've already said it a dozen times, and I suspect you'll hear it more. But you have to scan and identify the security vulnerabilities, and you can't scan these devices in the same way you scan a server or a desktop in a hospital. You have to use passive scanning techniques. You have to identify the security vulnerability, certainly, just like any network connected device. But then you have to group and classify devices. Not all devices store EPHI, but do you even know which ones do and which ones don't? We typically, when we go into a customer, we ask that. We get a shrug of the shoulders because most people don't know which devices are actually storing EPHI. Again, I've talked about how important the prioritization is, but it has to be based on patient risk and clinical operations, not just the technical security piece of this. And you have to build security remediation and clinical engineering preventive maintenance at the same time. They may be two different groups, they may be two different sets of processes, but if you don't integrate them at a high level, if you don't understand what each group is doing and when they're doing it, you can get crossways and actually make things worse. So you have to do that. And last, the traditional approach is rinse and repeat. You start the process over again. You've done your scan, you've identified the risk, you patch, and then you start the scanning again. In the medical device world, for a number of reasons, including the fact that these medical devices often go on and off the network, they're pulled for preventive maintenance. A device may be used in pediatrics one day and on a different floor in cardiac care the next day. This monitoring has to be done continuously. You can't just do it, fix things, and then come back next quarter and take another look. You have to continuously monitor the devices, where they are, what other devices they're talking to, and making sure they're set up properly and you're addressing all the vulnerabilities, both the security as well as the patient safety and clinical operations issues. And at this point, I'm going to hand off to the first of the smart people and let Cory tell you a little bit about the first steps in addressing this network security challenge.
Thanks, David. That was a great introduction to the challenges that are represented with connected medical devices, but I will go over some of the steps that we suggest that an organization takes to address some of the medical device security challenges. And just at a high level, those three initial steps here, may seem like common sense to some, or something that you would think, are already part of the ongoing management processes for medical devices. But we've generally seen, throughout the industry that these are actually a few of the most overlooked and under-prioritized activities when it comes to securing the network or your connected medical devices. So just at a high level, step one, you want to identify medical devices that are connected to the network and their key inventory attributes and security parameters. Step two, you want to proactively detect and classify device risks and take steps to mitigate them. And step three, define baseline device network behavior and manage device network access. So I'm going to go through step one and step two a little bit more in depth. Next slide, please. For step one, obtaining a comprehensive inventory list of network connected medical devices is the first step to understanding what security risks are presented in the clinical environment by those devices. And most organizations, honestly, they lack accurate insight into the network connected medical device inventory. From my experience, it's not that this issue exists because it was simply brushed under the rug. It's usually because the inventory databases that are maintained by clinical engineering or biomed were not initially designed to include fields for those network attributes for the connected medical devices. And at the time, it really wasn't needed. However, now that there's most definitely a need to obtain and document this information, most organizations realize that due to the unique structure of the medical device environment, like David mentioned, it will be a tedious and resource-intensive task to start collecting this information if you don't do it, the right way, using, network discovery solution, especially for the devices that already exist within the environment. Sometimes easier to, bake that process in for the devices that are new devices that are coming into the environment, but for those that already exist, it could be, a pretty serious issue. But lacking the insight can also cause, a huge risk for organizations, because not only can you not detect security issues with devices that you can't see or monitor, but you can't really protect those devices either. So the type of information that an organization should be collecting for any network connected medical devices is, and these aren't necessarily in order of priority, because I would say that, those initial medical device parameters, which would be your standard manufacturer, model, serial number type of information, should, be the top priority before anything else. But it's also extremely important to obtain information, as much information as possible, on the IT or software components of the medical devices, their cybersecurity specific properties like antivirus solutions, encryption protocols, secure configuration properties, things like that would fall into that cybersecurity realm. The direct and indirect device relationships, like as far as what other devices make up that full medical device system as a whole, and what other devices that system is actually communicating with, and the data flow for those network communications. Next slide, please. But as we mentioned before, as David went through, there are some distinct differences in the processes for obtaining this information for network-connected medical devices versus your traditional IT devices. For IT devices, they can generally be actively scanned and interrogated. IT devices correctly identify and present themselves on the network, and the network representation of IT devices is generally pretty complete and comprehensive. Plus most CMDBs or asset management databases that IT teams use to manage their equipment have plenty of information already existing on their assets, and they can use that information to correlate with information received from any kind of scanning process. That's generally, again, one of the biggest issues with medical devices. That initial data set is generally lacking anything to really be used to correlate that information. And that's, again, why you really have to be able to do it the right way starting out. For medical devices, active scanning of medical devices can produce undesired results, especially sometimes medical devices don't necessarily require a connection to an organization's network continuously, sometimes only when the device is being used directly for a patient procedure. And an active vulnerability scan could actually cause the device to malfunction or go down, poses that risk. Many medical devices will appear on scans as commodity IT hardware, and medical devices may not always transmit complete information like serial number or their cybersecurity capabilities. Again, an issue there with correlating what foundational information you have with what you're finding on the network. How do you know what you're finding is in the device that you're looking at in your database? And also complementary information might be driven from other sources, but it needs to be extracted and correlated with the information that you're seeing. So there's still that slightly humanistic aspect to ensuring that the information that you're looking at or you're looking for, per se, is collected and ultimately analyzed or organized by your organization to make sure that it makes sense specifically to you and what your environment looks like. That complementary information that's mentioned, manufacturers' disclosure statements, MDS2 forms, and really, user manuals. A lot of that information comes from the original equipment manufacturer when you initially purchase those devices. So that all, is extremely important to obtain and include in that device profile. Next slide, please. In the current state across the industry for addressing this particular step in the process is pretty standard across the board from what I have seen and regularly discussed with my colleagues. A number of network-based discovery solutions with a healthcare focus have been recently introduced. I'm sure, partially because of the recognized need for identifying IoT devices that are connected to a hospital's network. But all of these solutions provide similar goals for identifying and classifying connected devices, but they ultimately provide different levels of network parsing and extraction, data extraction. So it's important to ensure that, as an organization, you really do your research and know what the solution that you've, chosen is capable of doing. Kind of looking at not putting all of your eggs in one basket, looking at multiple solutions, and again, really doing your research. Many of those network discovery solutions can send and receive information from CMMS-based systems based on IP, MAC, serial number, manufacturer, bidirectional feedback to inventory databases. The visibility, again, remains the number one challenge for providers. Some of the solutions can go further and extract from other sources, like I mentioned, MDS2 forms, and enhance that device profile with the information that they're seeing from the network. That, I believe, is extremely important, knowing what the device is capable of doing from a security standpoint, using that MDS2 form, to know how the device should be configured versus maybe how it is actually configured. That's the type of information that you would see, using those two specific sources between the scanning and the MDS2 forms. So the challenge is that, no solution truly can obtain all of the necessary information, for medical devices because some of those devices just simply don't transmit the information that they're looking for. Especially if you're highly dependent on serial number or potentially location, again, just depending on what information you already have as a foundational inventory set. A correlation against, across different data sources might be needed to better solve the problem, as I mentioned. Next slide, please. All right, moving on to step 2. After an organization has overcome that initial inventory hurdle for connected medical devices, the time for both detection and protection, as I mentioned before, has officially arrived. Now that you know what's on your network, you should begin to proactively detect, assess, and respond to any medical device risks or vulnerabilities that are identified. So using a network solution to identify those active vulnerabilities that are presented by the devices on your network is crucial at this point. Looking for those specific device configurations or potentially misconfigurations. The impact potential for risks is very important, especially to base that impact potential on each device's unique network fingerprint. So what the device looks like on the network now, an inventory perspective from some of those security parameters, the relationships that exist, what the device is talking to, what the impact potential is going to look like if that device is affected or goes down. You also want to know the topology of the device and what it's communicating with on the network, as well as the specific security capabilities of the devices. Again, using that information to correlate with how that the devices are configured or being utilized in a clinical setting versus how they're being managed from a security perspective. Next slide, please. Again, some key differences here between IT devices and medical devices. For IT devices, vulnerability is a measure of simply the risk. The CVSS scores are a good example of that. Those scores that are included in any vulnerability alerts that you may see from ICS CERT or DHS. The base score shows the severity of a vulnerability that's presented. And once a vulnerability is identified, it generally needs to be patched. Often that can be done using automated tools or network solutions. We know this not to be true for medical devices. A vulnerability doesn't necessarily reflect medical device risk, even though that same CVSS score is used for medical device vulnerability alerts. There are quite a few other factors that have to be considered in the actual risk level for that vulnerability and that specific device. What the risk may be in one organization and clinical environment could be completely different from another. So, in my opinion, this is something that is also seemingly a little bit more resource intensive, actually identifying the risk level of the device. And that's simply something you can't get around because it is so organization specific, clinical end user specific almost in some instances. These factors have to be accounted for when you're determining the overall risk scoring aspect. So including the potential impact to patient care, a potential impact to critical data, EPHI or network data, and that impact to business operations specifically. Operational aspects for medical devices like asset utilization are also critical to the understanding, for impact for that business operation piece, should definitely be incorporated into determining the risk level for medical devices. You should know how often that device is being used. If there are additional devices of that same type and functionality, within the organization, that if this particular device were to go down, easily be replaced by another. How often is the device itself actually used in patient procedures, and things like that, should very specifically go into that overall risk scoring. In some cases, alternatives to security patching might exist to mitigate the risk and may be even more practical. Whether the alternatives to security patching exist, comes and smacks you in the face, or if you have to do a little bit of digging and research to identify those those alternatives, that's something that's basically always going to have to be done when you're looking at medical devices, because 9 times out of 10, security patches don't initially exist for those vulnerabilities. It's something that the manufacturer or vendor has to research and test, we hope, and approve to actually be, pushed out to those devices. And that's another thing, when I say pushed out to those devices, from an IT standpoint, many times there are automated tools to just simply push out security patches on a regular basis. For medical devices, very rare to see that exist, and generally there is no pushing out to the devices. In most cases, I should say, you have to actually physically touch the device, from a clinical engineering standpoint, or even working with the OEM or the vendor to have someone, from their side of the house come out to actually apply those security patches to the devices. So all of that is extremely important to keep in mind, or use it for calculation for the risk level and what you determine is appropriate moving forward to address a vulnerability that exists. And compensating controls, just those alternatives for medical device risk mitigation, should be proactively identified and approved by a group of organizational leaders, including IT and clinical engineering. So that collaborative communication, identifying some of those exceptions, or what what risk level or specific risk criteria that an organization is comfortable with accepting or acknowledging, and having already set aside specific compensating controls to apply in the case of some of those specific risk criteria are showing up on the network. That will save a lot of time, a lot of resources, and in many cases, those higher risk issues, those higher risk devices, saving some time and resources is everything to making sure that a risk gets mitigated before any serious issues pop up. Next slide, please. In the current state of this particular issue, most network solutions still focus on vulnerabilities or anomalies as a measure of risk and to prioritize mitigation. Again, something I discussed before, you want to be able to focus on more than just an active vulnerability or a misconfiguration anomaly for the device. You truly want to know the risk level, the impact and the likelihood of occurrence specifically for your organization and the environment in which that device exists. New solutions, which provide a proactive, contextual, and dynamic assessment of risk to prioritize only the most critical devices and vulnerabilities, have emerged, are continuously emerging. We've seen that less than 10% of the devices which are detected as having high priority vulnerabilities by scanning solutions are really at a high risk. More than 50% of high-risk devices are the workstations and servers connected to medical devices, which get used as general-purpose hardware, creating entry points into the network that are insecure and need to be patched. Some solutions also take into account how the asset is utilized and how the utilization changes over time to account for the business impact of a vulnerability, as I mentioned before. Even with the high-risk devices, ways exist to mitigate those high-risk vulnerabilities without requiring immediate security patching or updates, something that should be determined proactively, and working, again, those vendor relationships, manufacturer relationships are extremely important to have a collaborative relationship with the OEM. So, moving quickly in the event of a vulnerability alert is imperative to the risk level. The challenge is where security patching is absolutely required. Again, manufacturer approval or assistance is still required in most cases, pretty time consuming. Providers should really push manufacturers to work with solution providers to solve this problem. to design medical devices with the security capabilities and functionality that are so sorely lacking currently. They're causing, us to kind of run around and chase our tails rather than being able to actually get in front of the issue, working to mitigate those issues before they actually push a device to the market. That is, our responsibility to continuously push manufacturers to do that. And at this point, I believe I will pass the step 3 over to Shankar.
Yeah, thanks, Cory. So this is Shankar here. So Cory has gone through steps 1 and 2. Step 1, like she explained, was really identifying what's there in your environment, creating a complete inventory with all its parameters. Step 2 was the proactive risk. So that's where you identify the vulnerability. Once you've identified the vulnerability, you figure out whether it poses a risk to your environment based on a number of factors, not just based on the CVSS score, but based on the impact, based on how it's connected, based on the capabilities of the device, and based on the configuration of the device and so on. So that's a more proactive way of measuring risk and then trying to find ways to mitigate it. And step 3 is what I call a more reactive way of really looking at your risk, which is continuously monitoring what's happening in your environment, baselining every device, and then figuring out when things are going wrong so you can effectively mitigate it, or figuring out when things are going wrong early so you can actually mitigate the problem. And to do this, there are really 5 steps we talk about. So the first one is really when you continuously monitor, you got to baseline the device. So you got to figure out how every device is behaving, what's the baseline operation of the device itself. You have to figure out, once you know the baseline of the device, you can actually track the anomalies. There can be different kinds of anomalies. That can be a traditional security anomaly, like a malicious domain that it's browsing, or it's under a malware attack, or under some form of security attack, let's say a denial of service. Or it could be more misconfiguration anomaly, like the device is opening up maybe more ports that it shouldn't be opening up, or it's going to this external domain which it shouldn't be. So that could be the second kind of anomaly, or it could be an operational anomaly. Maybe there's a fault or warning on the device itself. And therein leads to my third point, where you have to understand the difference between security and operational anomaly, where sometimes a device might be misbehaving on the network because there is a fault or warning on the device, and that could be the root cause of the problem. Whereas some other cases, it could be a configuration issue that could be leading to something. Whereas in the other case, the final case, it could truly be a security attack that is your problem. And the way you address each of them is going to be different. And so there are a couple of actions you can take straight up on the network without touching the device. Once you know what is the root cause of the problem, one is to segment the device and put it on its own, VLAN. And so you can use the tools that can do the inventory and the risk analysis and this kind of monitoring to do the segmentation, or you can directly go to your network access point and do the segmentation right there with the data you have gathered. And the other thing, the most the most extreme action is to just block the device on the network. Now this step has to be done with great care, because anytime you block a device, even if there's a small probability that there was a false positive in your monitoring, then you could have pretty much created some operational issues which you didn't intend to. So you've got to be very careful in how you manage and block and protect these devices on the network. And so that is something to be very aware with medical devices as compared to general IT. Next slide. So like in the previous 2 steps, I'll explain the differences. With IT devices, any kind of unusual behavior is probably classified as an anomaly. Whereas in the medical device case, different devices can exhibit different behaviors. Like let's say a GE ultrasound might behave very differently from an LRS 8015 infusion pump. That might behave very differently, let's say, from a blood glucose monitoring system. And so you got to understand the context of the device, tie this back to the context of the device when you truly try and figure out what's a baseline and what's an anomaly. And that's something very unique to medical devices. Definitely, and in general, it's also unique to the class of IoT devices as well. Generally, with IT devices, you would find mostly security issues. You would in the medical device case, you would find all kinds of issues. It can be an operational issue, it can be a misconfiguration. So you cannot treat everything the same way. The way you treat each of them could be different, and so you're understanding a little bit of the root cause is more important. In the IT device case, I mean, people talk about segmentation and putting them in separate VLANs all the time. I know this is important in medical devices. That's what a lot of providers are starting to think about. They're starting to put budgets for. But we have to be careful about a couple of points. One is you have to take into account device relationships, how these devices are connected, where is the data flowing to, what are these kind of devices. All of those have to be taken into account. And then with medical devices, because you have a lot of medical devices moving around, you have new devices coming in, you have devices getting taken out for recall maintenance or general maintenance. Over time, how you maintain these VLANs can get very challenging. So you have to not only take into account the device categories and the relationships while segmentation, but as you maintain those VLANs and as you maintain those segments, those relationships, those characteristics of the device has to be carefully accounted for. And what we have seen is everything starts off well, but in a year or 2 years, the VLANs look completely horizontal. That means there is no VLAN in the network anymore, is what we have seen over time. And then finally, with IT devices, it can be blocked on the network straight up. I mean, the worst that could happen is someone is not able to access their email, or someone is not able to browse the internet. I mean, in the world of healthcare, something not being able to transmit or get essential information from another device could have far more catastrophic consequences. So you got to take into account the operations, you got to take into account what the device is used for, the class of the device, and then understand the impact before you and really evaluate whether you want to just block it completely on the network before you take such an action. Now, you can take intermediate steps instead of just blocking the device completely. You can block certain ports, certain services. That's definitely possible. You just have to make sure that you know what the impact of blocking a given service for that device is on the network as well. Next slide. And so what we have seen is, anomaly detection has become one of the most popular, or baselining has become one of the most popular topics in the industry. And this is something that, a lot of solutions provide today, which baseline and discover anomalies. Sometimes it's confused for risk. Like we discussed, risk in step 2 is very different from anomaly. Both are a measure of risk in some ways, but this is a different kind of risk than the vulnerability piece. And what we have seen is when this kind of baselining and anomalies, there are some security issues we have seen, malicious domains, IPs, adwares, and so on. But the main issues we have seen are really configuration issues. That imaging equipment is really going to the browsing some website, or this infusion pump is suddenly opening up a lot of ports. Majority of those can be solved much more simpler. It's good to know them because, having that knowledge will allow you to take actions early on, which would otherwise have created some problems in the future. So knowing these configuration issues and fixing them early on is definitely very valuable. And we have seen many of these are really in the imaging, where people treat them as commodity hardware on the network and don't really and are not really as careful about them as some of the other medical devices. And we have seen that some solutions many of these solutions can also help with segmentation and whitelisting, which, like I explained, has value to it, but also has to be done with great care. And that leads to my last point, where if you're whitelisting a device, or if you're blocking something or blocking a port, you have to also take into account how the device is being used. You have to make sure it's not potentially in use at the point in time when you are potentially doing something with the device. And then if you're doing any segmentation, are you taking into account the device characteristics itself? Okay, next slide. And so we have seen the first 3 cases. Obviously, the market is going to continue to move forward. I know a lot of people are still looking at inventory as their first step, and then risk as the next. But I would say in the next coming years, you will see solutions expand. Patch management is still a big issue. So we said that, hey, you can first discover whether the vulnerability is critical. If it is critical, is there an alternative to patching? In many cases, there is. There are techniques to do it. You can reach out to us later if you're interested in hearing more about that. And if you absolutely need to do a patch, Then the question is the patch available? Is the manufacturer provided a patch? Is it validated? And all of these issues have to be solved as well. And today, as it stands, it can be very tedious to get that information. So how do you really solve that? Will require the help of manufacturers. And then where should the resources be allocated is more of an organizational issue, which is very important to be answered. Whether clinical engineering does it, or traditional IT, or security does it. So there has to be some process in place along with some technology that can really solve the problem, and that will probably come in. And then the other part that will probably come in over time is compliance. As you gather more and more data about the device, you can probably start to look at how compliant are you with different specifications, how compliant are you with your own posture that you have determined for your network. And if something is not compliant, then you can probably take some action. There are certain tools that that are already there, generally for IT compliance. There are, in fact, my previous company, Symantec, also had such a tool. But many of those are more IT specific, and the evolution towards medical devices and its uniqueness is going to happen over time. And then next slide. And then finally, to just conclude, before we open it up for Q&A, like we said, as it stands, you've got to identify the device and all its parameters. That's absolutely the base and the first step that you have to do before you can do anything. You have to know which ones are your high-risk devices, the vulnerabilities, whether it poses a risk. If it poses a risk, what level of risk does it pose in your environment? And then you can figure out what kind of mitigations can you do. It might not just be a blocking on the network. There might be mitigations per vulnerability that could be done without doing a patch. And like I said, it's possible even without their patching constraints. And some of it is also because of the fact that the risks lie in the imaging workstation or the servers that connect to the medical device itself. It can be patched. And then finally, you've got to continuously monitor and baseline and figure out how you're going to solve the problems. And there are solutions that do all of this today, and then they are evolving. And there are tools. There are still challenges which require some manual intervention. I wouldn't say technology is a silver bullet, and it probably won't be. But there are challenges which require some human intervention, but the tools will continue to evolve to bridge some of those gaps, but you'll probably need some support in some form, either in-house or external, to address those. And so, like I said, finally, this is an ecosystem issue. No one single vendor or no one single solution can solve all your problems. So get involved with your ecosystem, with your manufacturers, ensure that your solution providers are involved, are interested at least in getting involved with the ecosystem as well. And together, you have to build the security to move things forward. Okay. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you very much, Shankar and Cory and David. And with that said, thank you for all the information. And let's move on to the questions. And I'll start out with the ones that we've gotten so far in the chat window. And again, if you want to ask a question, just go over that chat window and type it in, and we will address as many of the questions as we can get to. So the first question that I have for you is, what if we don't have the staff and the resources we need to get a handle on medical devices?
Oh, that sounds like one for me, Jana. And we see this actually across all of security nowadays. People don't have the resources. They don't have specific expertise. They just need help getting a handle on things and then developing the processes. And that's sometimes all you need is to get over that initial hurdle. And there are organizations that can help address this. Certainly one of our areas of focus is the biomedical device security. But it is highly likely, particularly whatever the specialized area, whether you're moving to the cloud, whether you're reconfiguring your network to build in more, to make it less flat, you're going to need some extra outside help because no one can afford to keep all that expertise on staff all the time. So we actually have just done a study with Chime, which shows that most organizations today are using third-party vendors to help them with major initiatives or major new projects.
All right. Thank you, David. And then the next question that I have, or actually there's quite a few people that asked about the presentation and the recording. And again, as a reminder, we will be sending that out after the webinar. But as far as specific questions to the content, we did get one asking, so what do we do about our Windows XP devices?
So I can answer that one. So this is Shankar here. So the Windows XP, obviously, as all of you know, this problem exists in every organization. There are always some legacy devices, and Windows XP is one of them. I would expand the question and say, what about the Windows 2000, or there are other older operating systems as well. And I would say for those, I mean, that goes to the point, step 2 that Cory was talking about. If you take the traditional IT approach, you would say, hey, this obviously has a lot of vulnerabilities which are not patched, so you're going to have to replace it. Definitely over time, you should look at replacing it. But first, in your network, you have to understand whether those vulnerabilities pose a risk. And this is where the uniqueness of medical devices and the associated components come in. Just because there is a Windows XP which has vulnerabilities, the vulnerabilities might not pose a high risk in your environment. So you have to understand whether the vulnerabilities pose a risk in your environment. If so, is it a critical risk? And if there are just like a handful of vulnerabilities for the device, maybe there are alternatives to fixing it to a patch, because a patch might not be available anyway for some of those. You might be able to understand how the vulnerability is exploited in a network and appropriately take an action just for certain vulnerabilities. And so that you might be able to mitigate a lot of your Windows XP or 2000 issues right there. And for the ones which are left, which has a lot of high-risk vulnerabilities, which you cannot do anything about, I mean, you can start to look at putting it in its own high-risk VLAN, or you can just monitor them. And of course, if it's near the end of your service cycle, and if you're anyway looking to replace the device, and that might be another way to get it out of your system. But the key is not every XP device might always pose a risk. You have to understand the risk level before you decide to take action.
All right, thank you so much. The next question I have is asking about, is there a resource for best practices or a template for policies around devices?
Well, I'll chime in a bit. I'm not aware of a repository of best practices today around this. There are dozens of resources available. The HHS task force, actually, one of their 6 imperatives, the number 2 imperatives, was focused on medical devices. So you can go find the HHS task force on cybersecurity in the healthcare industry. There's numerous references attached to that, and there was a significant focus on biomedical devices. The other source that was just recently released was a publication from Asimily, the Advancing Safety, and the group that is focused on advancing safety in health technology. And their publication is called Medical Device Cybersecurity, a Guide for Health Technology Management Professionals. It was published, like I said, by Asimily, AAMI. You can go to their site. That source is full of chapters and the process by industry experts, people who are working in the field, clinical engineers, security personnel, and great resources in there, great approaches and strategies for how to address things, as well as contacts if you just need to call someone. So those are the 2 that come to mind, and I'm certainly open. If, like I said, I'm not the smart one, so if Cory or Shankar have any other ideas, you're welcome to join in.
Yeah, I mean, I
nope,
think
David, I would just
covered it. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yep, I would just add to it that Asimily guidance is for cybersecurity for medical devices for the healthcare technology management teams is extremely helpful if from a risk management perspective, compliance, security, kind of combines all of those topics in one. So that was definitely the best that I have seen thus far.
Shankar, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think Cory and David have covered it. Thank you.
Okay, great. And then the next question that I have is, are there any tools out in the industry that can help us with inventories in the 3 steps?
There are tools, as the point of our whole presentation talked about, and they are fairly new. There were not tools really that could address this. They took a more traditional approach to network scanning and finding the devices, but there are a number of tools, and part of it will depend on what tool set you have in-house today. I wouldn't necessarily advocate that anyone go rip and replace. But if you have tools that you can leverage, if you don't have tools, you probably need to make a shopping trip. But there are tools that can help you with this. And then I would just reiterate at that point, Shankar said it best, technology is not going to be a silver bullet. One of the sayings I'm fond of using is, a fool with a tool is still a fool. So you have to have the tool to do the inventory. The days of going out and sending dozens of biomets out to walk the hospital and open closets and look in rooms and elevator shafts, wherever you might find stuff, are over. You are going to have to automate this to a great degree. But if you just have a tool and aren't fixing your processes around biomedical device management and security from a more traditional approach, and hopefully integrating them, you're really not buying anything. You're identifying a solution and maybe making a bigger mess. And then ultimately, like security, after you've done the people and the process, the most important factor is after you've done the technology in the process, is the people. So you've got to train them. You've got to have the right people in place. You've got to have the right assignments made, and you've got to make this an ongoing process. As we've said repeatedly, particularly with the medical devices, this has to be a continuous, ongoing thing. You can't, if you detect an event, you can't just quarantine the device in the middle of whatever it's doing. There's a very well-known incident several years back where a fetal monitor during a delivery went down. It got a push from Windows, and it put the Windows screen up on the fetal monitor. Of course, fetal monitors don't have keyboards and mice attached when they're used in the procedure. When they're monitoring an infant being born, it had a happy ending, but you've got to take an integrated approach. Just pushing patches and just knowing where devices are, you've got to get those workflows worked out as well. So yeah, there are tools. The tools are only the first step in the process of getting a handle on your biomedical device security.
All right, thank you, David. And we have 1 minute left, so I can squeeze in maybe this last question. So you mentioned that not all information is transmitted on the wire when it comes to device inventory buildup, and a good solution should be able to correlate information from other sources. What other sources could be helpful, and how are they integrated with that from network monitoring?
Shankar, I'll let you dive in.
Yeah, so I mean, outside of the network, obviously there are MDS tools which contain some piece. Obviously, MDS tools aren't always reliable. There are mistakes in that as well. But there are certain answers there which, if correlated over time across MDS tools, could become valuable. There's information in the CMMS that you might have. You might have some information in CMMS. It might not be accurate. It may not be updated. But whatever information is there, when pulled with the other two sources, could provide a much better picture. You might have run some scans sometime, maybe not on the medical device, maybe on some of the workstations associated with that. Some of that has information that could be pulled in if it is available, and a couple of other databases in your thing, like you might have a CMDB, you might have some information in your logs. So overall, I would say outside of the network, there is documents, there is databases broadly, CMMS is there. There could be information in scanners. I would say those are some of the predominant ones we have seen that you can probably pull in. Each of them by itself is flawed or not always accurate, but when tied together and correlated and refined, I think they can provide a much better picture.
All right, thank you. And then just one more question. The Anomalies guide that you're talking about, one attendee said that they see it's $225. Is there a free version that you know of, or do you have to purchase it?
I am not aware of a free version, but there is a member discount if you're a member of AMI, or this might be a resource you pool. You get your biomed team and your IT team together, and they share a resource, and you've actually started the process of improving your working together. But I'm not aware of a free version of the book out there, and it is. I will be the first to agree it is pricey. But in this case, you get what you pay for.
Excellent. Well, thank you. And with that, we're a little bit over the hour. I want to, again, thank all of our speakers for their time, and as well as all of our attendees. We appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join us today. And I will send out the slides and a recording to the webinar later today. And have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.